Move him out. Save the money. That's what my brother said, while I was strapped to a heart monitor, unable to speak. They were already filling out the discharge papers when I realized why he came so fast. Not to hold my hand. To take my company. By noon, he'd locked me out of my accounts. By evening, my truck was gone, my office passwords changed, and vendors were being told I was unstable. I was still hooked to IVs when he named himself interim CEO, but the surgeon had seen enough. He leaned in and whispered, "Are you ready?" He wasn't just talking about my heart. He meant war. I might have been too weak to stand, but I'd built empires from the ground up, and I kept every receipt. Let's just say, the paper trail was about to bury them. My name is Mark Delaney, and I'm 45 years old. Each morning starts the same. Coffee brewing by 5, work boots lined up by the door I installed myself. My brother David, who's been eyeing my company books lately, keeps showing up unannounced at job sites, while my sister Rachel nods along with whatever scheme he's pitching that week. This morning, my calloused thumb traced 20 years of receipts filed in my workshop cabinet. Every nail, every contract, every promise kept. The sound of David's truck in my gravel driveway made my shoulders tighten. He'd brought Rachel this time, both of them carrying folders I didn't recognize. My hand instinctively touched the notarized copies locked in my desk drawer. The same discipline that built my business had taught me to keep duplicate records of everything. But let me start from the beginning. I never saw the collapse coming. One minute I was checking lumber deliveries at the Miller site, clipboard in hand, and the next, well, you know that feeling when you've missed a step on a ladder? Multiply that by about 1,000. The pain hit like someone had dropped a steel beam across my chest. Tommy, my newest hire, caught me before I hit the plywood. Poor kid. His face went whiter than mine probably was. "Boss, someone call 911. His voice cracked like he was back in high school. I wanted to tell him I was fine, but breathing had suddenly become a full-time job. The EMTs were quick, I'll give them that. They had me loaded up and sirens wailing before I could even text David about covering my afternoon meetings. Not that it mattered. He was already at the hospital when they wheeled me in, Rachel right behind him. That should have been my first clue something was off. How fast they both showed up. You ever notice how hospitals have their own smell? It's like bleach trying to mask something worse. The fluorescent lights in the ICU made everything look slightly wrong, like a photo that's been copied too many times. They hooked me up to more machines than I had power tools in my garage, each one with its own special beep or hum. I expected, I don't know, maybe some hand-holding, some worried looks my way. Instead, David kept finding reasons to study his shoes whenever I caught his eye. Rachel spent more time whispering with some suit-wearing hospital administrator than checking on her own brother. The privacy curtain wasn't exactly soundproof, but they kept their voices just low enough that I could only catch fragments. Insurance limits, private room rates, transfer options. Know what it's like when you're installing cabinets and the bubble in your level shows something's not quite right? That's how I felt watching them. Every glance, every half-smile they shared when they thought I was sleeping. It all added up to something out of plumb. The worst part was feeling trapped there, stuck to those monitors like a house tied down for a hurricane. Each time footsteps approached my bed, conversations would cut off mid-sentence. Then they'd start up again down the hall. Voices dropped to that special kind of whisper that makes you strain to hear. My company, everything I'd built over 20 years of 7-day weeks, was sitting out there unprotected while I lay there counting ceiling tiles. I'd learned early on that success in contracting meant watching the details. Now I needed to protect my life's work the same way I protected every job site, with constant vigilance and careful documentation. I kept my eyes closed but my ears open, playing possum while David and Rachel did their rounds. The curtain rings would rattle, and I'd hear papers shuffling. They were reviewing something, numbers being quoted, with the kind of precision that only comes from having them written down. Then I heard it, David's voice. Not even trying to whisper anymore. "He doesn't need ICU. Move him out. Save the money." My heart monitor skipped a beat, but I forced myself to keep breathing steady. My own brother, talking about me like I was just another line item to be cut from a budget. The administrator must have said something I couldn't catch, because David's voice got harder. "Look, we're his family. We're the ones dealing with the costs here. Move him to regular care. Today." I lay there, tubes in my arms and wires on my chest, while my siblings plotted to downgrade my care like they were haggling over lumber prices. The room seemed to tilt sideways, but the machines kept their steady rhythm, masking how my world had just shifted on its axis. That night was hell. Every time I'd start drifting off, some machine would screech like a smoke detector with dying batteries. The nurses were kind enough, but their footsteps and whispered conversations kept me on edge. You know that feeling when you're working a job site and something's not right, but you can't put your finger on it? That's how I felt, lying there under those fluorescent lights. Dawn crept in through the blinds, painting stripes across the linoleum floor. That's when Dr. Harrison showed up, the chief surgeon himself, which was unusual for morning rounds. He had this way about him, calm but alert, like a seasoned foreman who spotted trouble before anyone else. He checked my vitals, made some notes, then did something odd. Instead of heading straight out, he leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "They want you gone. But, are you ready?" 7 words. Simple enough. But they hit me like a foundation crack in a basement wall. Both a warning and a way forward. I studied his face, looking for any hint of what he meant. Ready for what, exactly? I kept my voice steady, though my heart was hammering hard enough to make the monitor skip. He gave me this look, the kind I give apprentices when they need to figure something out for themselves. His eyes flicked meaningfully toward the chart at the foot of my bed. Documentation always comes down to paperwork, doesn't it? Whether you're building a house or fighting for your life. Remember counting studs to keep your mind focused during a tough job? That's what I did with those ceiling tiles while I tried to sort things out. 16 across, 24 long, 384 squares of drop ceiling, each one perfectly aligned. Unlike my life, which was tilting sideways faster than a poorly braced wall. I reached for my phone. Had to check something. The banking app lit up with notifications I'd been ignoring. There it was, buried in the legalese. Temporary custodial access granted. My stomach clenched. In 20 years of running my business, I'd never seen those words without a stack of signed papers behind them. "Hey Siri, call the office," I said, trying to keep the shake out of my voice. Instead of Susan's cheerful greeting, I got David's recorded message. "You've reached Delaney Contracting. This is David speaking, interim management. Please leave." I hung up before the beep. Interim management? Since when? When the morning nurse came in, Tracy, I think her name was, I asked to see my medical paperwork. "Just wanted to review things," I said. She gave me that professional smile they must teach in nursing school. "You'll need to speak with administration about that, Mr. Delaney. Hospital policy." "Look," I said, trying to sound reasonable. "I just want to understand what's happening with my care." Her smile never wavered. "Of course, I'll have someone from administration come by later today." But I knew that game. I'd played it myself with difficult clients. Deflect, delay, drown them in politeness until they give up. Only this time, I was the one getting the runaround. Everything clicked into place, like the last piece of trim on a perfect joint. While I was stuck here, tied down by tubes and wires, David had somehow slid my company, my life's work, into his care. 20 years of sweat equity, transferred with a few signatures I never saw. The monitor betrayed me then, beeping faster as my pulse jumped. Through the thin walls, I heard a printer whir to life. Discharge papers, I'd bet my last dollar on it. They were getting ready to move me out, just like David wanted. You ever have one of those moments where the whole world comes into sharp focus? Where suddenly you see exactly what's happening, but you're powerless to stop it? That's where I was, watching my company, my legacy, slip through my fingers one beep at a time. As soon as Dr. Harrison turned to leave, I called him back. "Doc, wait. If they push me out," I glanced at the door, lowering my voice. "How do I protect the truth?" He closed the door with deliberate care, then pulled up a chair. His movements were precise, like a man laying out tools before a delicate job. "Listen carefully," he said, leaning forward. "Medical charts tell stories, not just numbers, but observations, time-stamped notes about family interactions, conversations about care decisions, even visiting patterns." He paused, making sure I followed. "Every entry becomes part of the legal record." I'd done enough courthouse testimony on construction disputes to know where he was going. "And affidavits? Notarized statements carry weight," he nodded. "Especially from attending physicians who document unusual pressure regarding patient care." My hands were shaking. Damn medication. But I grabbed a napkin from my water tray and started writing. The pen kept slipping, but I forced out the words. Chart notes, timestamps, witness statements, legal record. "Timing is everything," Dr. Harrison added quietly. "And remember, consent matters. Medical consent, financial consent, they're separate things." I circled both words on my napkin. The paper was thin, tearing under my pen, but those two words stood out clear. Timing. Consent. Later that morning, I had billing come up. Played it casual, just asking about insurance coverage. The clerk was young, eager to help. "Oh yes, your family's been very involved," she said, brightly. "They've emphasized their support in transitioning you to a lower level of care. It's helping with the approval process." My jaw clenched. Family support. Huh? That's how they were spinning it. When the stack of forms started appearing, routine paperwork they called it, I read every single page. Signed only what I absolutely had to for treatment. But anything that looked remotely like power of attorney or financial authority, those stayed blank. You know that feeling when you're inspecting a foundation and spot hairline cracks spreading? That's how I felt when this young resident walked in, tablet in hand. Fresh-faced kid, probably still making payments on his med school loans. "Just need your signature on the discharge summary," he said, swiping through screens. "We'll finalize it once your stats stabilize." I stared at those vital sign numbers on the monitor. Pulse, blood pressure, oxygen. My whole life reduced to decimal points while my real legacy was being stripped away. The company I'd built from the ground up, being dismantled while they debated whether my heart rate was stable enough to kick me out. Had to distract myself, or I'd lose it. So I did what I always did when stress hit. Started building in my head. Mapped out a simple ranch house, stud by stud. 16 inches on center. Load-bearing walls need double top plates. Headers over every opening. The numbers were solid, dependable. They didn't shift like family loyalty or hospital policies. "I'd like to speak with case management," I told the resident. "And make sure Dr. Harrison's observations are in the record." He blinked, thrown off script. I'll let them know." Through the wall, I heard that damn printer start up again. Couldn't see it, but I knew what was coming. Sure enough, when the nurse brought my evening meds, I caught a glimpse of tomorrow's date on a form. Morning discharge, already in the system. The trap was closing. They'd transfer my company while I was still officially under medical care, then push me out before I could fight back. Clean, efficient, just like a well-planned demolition. I looked down at my napkin, those shaky circles around timing and consent. My handwriting was weak, but my resolve was hardening like concrete. They thought they had me cornered, but every contractor knows. Sometimes the tighter the space, the more leverage you can get. The wheelchair felt like surrender. Hospital policy, they said. All patients leave this way. The orderly was chatting about something, but all I could focus on was the hollow echo of wheels on linoleum, carrying me toward an exit I wasn't ready to face. You ever notice how different a place feels when you're leaving under dark clouds? That antiseptic hospital air that had bothered me for days now felt like the last breath of safety. Each tile we rolled over was one tile closer to facing what they'd done while I lay helpless. The drive home was a blur. My neighbor Pete had offered to pick me up. Decent guy. Always borrowed tools properly and returned them clean. He tried making small talk, but I just watched familiar streets slide by, my chest tight with more than surgical pain. "You sure you don't want me to stay a while?" Pete asked as we pulled up. I shook my head. "Thanks, but I need to sort some things." The house looked the same. That's what hit me first. Like nothing had changed, though everything had. The porch steps I'd rebuilt last spring still held solid. The brass mailbox still caught afternoon light, but when I opened it, the usual stack of business correspondence was thin. Too thin. Inside, my hands went straight to the kitchen counter where I always sorted mail. The vendor invoices that should have been waiting weren't there. Called Midwest Lumber. They'd been my supplier for 15 years. "Oh, we got a notice," Sarah in accounting said. "All statements are being redirected per interim management protocol." My throat went dry. Interim management? That's what the paperwork said. "Your brother submitted it last week." I stumbled to my office, fired up the laptop. The banking portal looked normal until I tried logging in. Account access suspended. Security verification required. The recovery number listed wasn't mine. They'd changed the multi-factor authentication to a number I didn't recognize. That's when I noticed the driveway through my office window. The empty space where my F-150 should have been parked hit me like a punch to the gut. That truck was more than transportation. It was my mobile office. Carried every tool I needed to run jobs. My hands were shaking when I dialed the equipment yard. "Hey, Mark," Bobby answered. Yeah, we got the papers Tuesday. Vehicle reassignment for business continuity. Had to release the truck to maintain operations. You know how it is." I did know how it was. Every contract has language about business continuity. My brother hadn't just taken pieces. He'd used my own careful documentation against me. The house creaked then. That familiar settling sound old homes make. But now it sounded different. like disappointment, like something giving up. I've renovated dozens of houses, and each one has its own voice. Right then, my house seemed to sigh. The file cabinet in my office had always been my anchor. Every contract, every permit, every receipt in its place. But when I pulled open the drawer, the tabs were wrong. Just slightly out of order, the kind of thing only someone who filed them every day would notice. Someone had been through them in a hurry. I grabbed a spiral notebook, one of those cheap ones with the wire binding, and started writing. Each missing piece, each locked account, each redirected document. Treated it like a punch list on a job site. Identify the problem, document the damage, plan the fix. My hand was trembling so bad I could barely read my own writing. The truck key hook by the door caught my eye. Empty now. Useless. The sight of it sparked something in my mind. A question that made my stomach turn. "What did you sign, Tommy?" I whispered to the empty house. "What did you put your name on, little brother?" The house had no answer. Just another tired creak, like it knew we were both in trouble. The next 2 weeks taught me what quicksand feels like. Every morning I'd wake up thinking, today's the day I get answers, and every evening I'd add another page of no to my notebook. You ever spent 4 hours on hold with a bank? I have, multiple times now. Always got the same response. We apologize, but without proper authorization. They'd trained their people well. Nobody slipped. Nobody sympathized enough to bend the rules. Just polite walls of policy, smooth as glass. The vendors were worse, in a way. These were people I'd worked with for years. Folks who knew my voice, remembered my jobs. Now they'd hit me with careful pauses and rehearsed lines about interim procedures and corporate protocols. Made me wonder what kind of story Tommy had fed them. I sat at my kitchen table one morning, watching steam rise from my coffee. Same mug I'd used for 15 years of Sunrise Project ACE meetings. Funny how fast reputation turns to vapor. I muttered to nobody. My strength was coming back slower than the doctors promised. Maybe because instead of proper rest, I was burning hours trying to piece together what Tommy had done. Every call drained me more than hanging drywall ever had. By afternoon, I'd usually end up dozing in my chair, unopened mail piling up like autumn leaves. Through the industry grapevine, I heard bits about Tommy. He was making the rounds, all confidence and concern, probably telling everyone how he'd stepped up to save the business while his unstable brother recovered. I could picture him in my office, leaning back in my chair, explaining to our biggest clients how he was stabilizing things. That Friday hit different. Maybe it was the weather. One of those gray days that feels heavy before it rains. Maybe it was just 2 weeks of no, finally crushing something inside me. I couldn't even open my notebook. Just sat there as the room got darker, not bothering with lights. You know that moment when giving up starts to look reasonable? When you think maybe surrender would hurt less than fighting? That's where I was, watching shadows crawl across my floor and wondering if Tommy had won simply by wearing me down. The knock startled me. Not the quick rap of a delivery guy or the tentative tap of a neighbor checking in. This was 3 solid hits, like someone marking studs through drywall. I almost didn't answer, but something in that knock pulled me up, got me moving toward the door. Frank McKenzie stood on my porch, looking exactly like he had when he'd run crews for me. Heavy canvas jacket, hands that could true a warped beam through sheer stubbornness, eyes that measured everything they saw. Under his arm was a stack of papers, folded and worn at the corners like they'd been carried a while. "You gonna let me in, Mark?" he asked. "Or are we having this conversation where the whole street can hear?" The smell hit me as he passed. Drywall dust and motor oil, honest work embedded in denim. Suddenly my kitchen felt more solid, like someone had finally leveled a tilted floor. "Heard you were in the hospital," he said, dropping into a chair. Then heard some other things that didn't sound right. He laid that stack of papers on the table. So I dug these out. "What are they?" My voice was rougher than I'd expected. "Copies." Frank spread them out. "Receipts, work orders, material transfers. Been keeping my own records since that highway job where the numbers went weird. Never trusted your brother after that. Figured someday someone might need to know what really happened." I stared at those papers, each one a brick in the foundation Tommy was trying to steal. "I kept copies of everything," Frank said quietly. "Every change order he tried to slide through, every adjusted invoice. 5 years of your brother's creative math, all documented." Something sparked in my chest, a feeling I hadn't had since before the hospital, like when you finally find the right tool for a tough job. "See?" Frank tapped the papers. I knew something smelled off about this whole thing, and in my experience, rot doesn't fix itself. Someone's got to cut it out. I cleared the kitchen table, stacking old mail in a corner. My hands weren't quite steady yet, but they knew what they were doing. Frank pulled over my desk lamp, the one with the adjustable neck I'd used for late-night estimates, and started laying out papers like we were planning a 3-story addition. "Watch this," he said, sliding 2 contracts side by side. "See how the dates don't match up?" I leaned in, squinting at delivery schedules that didn't align with their invoices. Something cold settled in my gut as I spotted more discrepancies. "Hold on," I muttered, grabbing a red pen. "Let me show you something. You know how you develop certain habits over the years? Mine was signatures. Always careful, always consistent. I'd learned that lesson early. Sloppy signatures meant sloppy accountability. I started circling Tommy's attempts at copying my hand. The slant was wrong, too rushed, like he couldn't be bothered to practice properly. "There." Frank pointed at a particularly bad forgery on a vendor notice. "That one's from 3 days after you went down." Redirected all the statements to his home address. Smooth, right? I felt my jaw tighten. Real smooth. "Keep going." Frank pulled out an email thread about payroll adjustments. Nothing too obvious. Just small changes that added up wrong. But what caught my eye was a calendar invite buried in the header. "Board meeting. Annual review and restructuring." 6 weeks, I said, the words tasting bitter. He's giving himself 6 weeks to make everything look normal before calling a vote. Remember that old saying about seeing red? Well, I saw plenty as I grabbed the wall calendar and started marking days. Every Sunday got a thick slash through it, counting down to when Tommy planned to make his temporary theft permanent. "We need more," I said, pushing back from the table. My chest was starting to ache, but not from the surgery. Those hospital records, the chief surgeon's notes, the discharge timing. And those account lockouts weren't accidents. Frank nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I can hit up the suppliers tomorrow, get statements showing when the changes kicked in. Most of them know me. They'll talk." "Good." I started a list in my notebook. Real evidence we'd need. The kind that holds up when people start asking hard questions. I'll handle the medical side. That surgeon knew something was wrong. Bet he documented everything. The house felt different now. Like when you finally spot the leak that's been dripping behind your walls. Doesn't fix the damage, but at least you know where to start cutting. My muscles still complained when I moved too fast, but there was fuel in them again. Purpose has a way of doing that. Turns out it's better medicine than half the pills they gave me. "You realize," Frank said, stacking papers back into folders, "this clock's been ticking since they pulled that IV out of your arm." I looked at the calendar again, those red slashes screaming at me. "Yeah," I said, checking my watch like it might somehow give us more time. "And it's getting real loud now." The dining room had grown dark while we worked. I switched on another lamp, and our shadows stretched across the papers, like time itself was reaching for us. Frank was right. That clock had started in the hospital. But now it was running in time with my pulse, marking seconds we couldn't waste. The hospital corridors hadn't changed in 3 weeks. Same antiseptic smell, same fluorescent hum. But this time, I walked in under my own power. Even if my steps weren't quite as steady as I wanted them to be. I'd timed my records request for when I knew Chief Surgeon would be doing his rounds. Didn't want this conversation happening in some sterile office with administrators hovering nearby. You learn timing in construction. When to pour concrete. When to frame. When to trust your gut about the weather. This felt like one of those moments. The iodine smell hit stronger near the surgical wing. I spotted him coming out of a patient's room, tablet in hand. That same measured look on his face that I remembered from those crucial ICU conversations. "Mr. Delaney," he said, glancing both ways before stepping closer. "You're looking better. Getting there. Listen, about what happened." I kept my voice low, steady. "I need your help making it official." He nodded once, sharp and professional. "The forced discharge, family pressure." I documented everything. His eyes narrowed slightly. "I can prepare an affidavit. Have it notarized by tomorrow. Some things shouldn't happen in hospitals." The relief hit me harder than I expected. Here was the man who'd kept my heart beating, now helping me protect everything else I'd built. "Thank you," I managed, "for all of it." Back home, Frank and I turned my dining room into something between a war room and a job site office. 3 binders emerged: timeline, finance, and authority. Every document got dated and initialed in the corner, just like we did with inspection reports. Can't argue with documentation when it's handled right. "Your brother's getting sloppy," Frank said, filing another vendor statement. "Called Martinelli's Supply trying to reroute their billing." Owner's son remembers you from that school renovation job 3 years back. Wouldn't process the change without original signatures. I nodded, marking it in the timeline. How many others pushed back? 4 so far. Jackson's Hardware, Pioneer Lumber. Frank checked his notes. They're all willing to confirm the attempts in writing. Tommy's interim management story isn't playing as well as he thought. Every morning, I got up a little earlier than the day before. Started with simple exercises. Contractor's version of physical therapy. Had to build back the strength to stand in front of that board without wavering. You can have all the evidence in the world, but if you can't deliver it right, people see the shake in your hands instead of the truth in your papers. Straighten those shoulders, Frank coached one afternoon, playing audience while I practiced my presentation. Remember how you'd walk a client through a major renovation plan? Same thing here, just laying out the facts, showing the support beams of your case. He was right. I'd spent decades explaining complex projects to people who needed confidence in their contractor. This was just another kind of blueprint, one that showed how carefully my brother had tried to demolish everything I'd built. The calendar on my wall got thinner every morning. Each red slash brought us closer to that boardroom showdown. 7 days out, I packed those binders into my old contractor's bag. The heavy canvas one that used to carry my levels and torque wrenches. Felt right somehow, using a worker's tools to protect a worker's legacy. That night, I set an alarm on my phone, labeled it simply, Boardroom. Stared at those 9 letters until the screen went dark. Funny how a single word can hold so much weight, like the moment before you cut a load-bearing wall. Knowing everything depends on getting it exactly right. The phone sat there, black and silent, but I could hear that alarm already ringing in my head. 7 days. After decades of building things to last, I had 1 week to prove that what I'd created deserved to survive. You know what's funny about Sunrise? When you're in construction, it usually means coffee and crew assignments, the start of honest work. But that morning, watching the sky turn from black to purple through my windshield, it felt more like heading into demolition. Frank's thermos rattled against the cup holder like loose hardware in an old toolbox, a familiar sound that somehow made everything feel more real. "Run it by me again," Frank said, eyes on the highway ahead. I'd rehearsed the sequence so many times I could probably recite it in my sleep. Timeline first, establishes the pattern. Then the discharge. Affidavit from Dr. Matthews, showing they pushed me out early. Finally, the financial stuff, all those attempted reroutes and lockouts. My hand tightened on my own thermos. Got to lay the foundation before you show the damage. We hit downtown while most office workers were still hitting snooze buttons. The parking garage was mostly empty. Just a few early bird cars scattered across the concrete levels. I'd pushed for arriving an hour early. Needed time to let my pulse settle, to breathe in that familiar mix of exhaust and concrete dust that reminded me of job sites. "Remember that Methodist church renovation?" I asked Frank as we found a spot. "How we got there 2 hours early just to walk the space, get a feel for what we were dealing with?" Frank snorted. "Yeah, and good thing too. Found that rotted support beam before the crew showed up. Same principle here." I checked my watch. 7:15 a.m. Need to know the terrain. We sat there for a while, watching shadows shrink as the sun climbed higher. Through the garage's open side, I could see windows starting to light up across the building's face. Like someone walking through rooms, flipping switches. My company's floors. My life's work. Brightening floor by floor. I pulled out my phone, punched in Dr. Matthews' office number. His nurse answered, crisp and professional, even at this hour. "Yes, Mr. Delaney. The courier delivered the affidavit to your company's legal department yesterday afternoon. Signature confirmed. Thank you." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "And thank him again for me." Frank helped me shoulder the contractor's bag, heavier now with those 3 binders inside. And we headed for the lobby. I remembered the pride I'd felt the first time I walked through those glass doors, seeing my company's name etched above the security desk. Now it felt like disputed territory. Every polished surface reflecting uncertainty back at me. Movement caught my eye. Through the conference room glass, I spotted Tommy. My brother was working the room like he'd been born to it, laughing with Davis and Chen from the board. He had his hand on Chen's shoulder, that politician's gesture of false intimacy. I watched him squeeze once, like he was giving some kind of blessing. "Easy," Frank muttered beside me. He'd seen my jaw clench. The boardroom was empty when we entered. I pulled out the binders, set them on the heavy oak table, found myself adjusting their edges, making sure the corners lined up perfect, same way I'd square up lumber before a big frame-up. Some habits stick with you. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making everything look slightly unreal. I could hear voices in the hallway now, getting closer. My pulse kicked up again, but I focused on those binders, on the evidence inside, on 15 years of kept promises and documented work. The door opened. Karen from reception stood there, tablet in hand. "They're ready for you." I nodded to Frank and stood, squared my shoulders like I was about to walk a beam. The table seemed to stretch for miles, but I knew this path. One step at a time, just like building anything. That matters. I stood at the head of that boardroom table, feeling the weight of 15 years press against my spine. The faces around me, some familiar, some carefully blank, waited like a crew before demo day. You know that moment? When everyone's got their assignments, but nobody moves until you give the word? "Let's establish the timeline first," I said, keeping my voice as level as a laser sight. Frank moved around the table like he was distributing materials at a job site, placing binders in front of each board member with practiced efficiency. Everything in these folders is dated, documented, and independently verifiable. Tommy, I couldn't bring myself to think of him as my brother right then, sat back with his arms crossed, that familiar smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The same look he'd give when someone questioned his methods on a project. I nodded to Frank, who handed the company lawyer a separate envelope. "This is a notarized affidavit from Dr. Matthews, chief surgeon at County General." The lawyer's eyebrows lifted slightly as he broke the seal. "You'll want to pay particular attention to his observations on pages 3 and 4, specifically the chart entries regarding my discharge timeline." "This is ridiculous," Tommy cut in, leaning forward. "Some doctor's opinion about hospital procedures has nothing to do with corporate governance." His voice carried that familiar edge, the one he'd use when trying to talk over problems instead of fixing them. I kept my eyes on the lawyer. "The timestamp on that discharge order might interest you. Compare it to the dates on the bank access changes in Section 2 of your binders." Two of the directors, Martinez and Wilson, were already flipping pages, their faces tightening as numbers started lining up. You could almost hear the framework clicking into place. "If you'll turn to the vendor section," I continued, "you'll find notices that don't quite match the story of my brother's temporary care of company assets." The word care tasted like sawdust in my mouth. "Note the dates and the authorization signatures." Tommy's chair scraped back. "This is a waste of everyone's time. We're here to discuss company direction, not personal. Medical—" "The emails," I said quietly, and his mouth snapped shut. "I'd like the board to review the communication threads marked in blue. Pay special attention to discussions about continuity planning." The room filled with the sound of turning pages. I watched faces change as they found the tabs where subject lines mentioned my status, like I was some piece of equipment being evaluated for replacement. Frank moved again, smooth and deliberate as a well-oiled machine. He slid a thin stack of papers across to the lawyer, printouts we'd saved for last, knowing they'd hit like a foundation crack running straight through Tommy's carefully constructed story. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, started reading. 3 lines down, he stopped. His finger rested on words that seemed to rise off the page and hang in the air between us. "As good as dead." Tommy's face went the color of fresh joint compound. Around the table, heads snapped up like studs under impact. The lawyer cleared his throat. "This email thread. Mr. Thomas Delaney discussing his brother's condition with—" He squinted at the screen capture. "With 3 of our major suppliers?" "Keep reading," I said softly. "The part about making arrangements while I was conveniently unavailable might interest everyone." The silence in that room felt like the moment after you pull off old drywall, when you first see what's really been happening behind the surface. Tommy's carefully built narrative was crumbling, and every person at that table could see the rot underneath. I didn't need to say more. The evidence was doing its job. Each page another nail in a coffin Tommy had built himself. The way he stared at that email printout, like a man watching his own shadow lengthen at sunset, told me he knew it, too. Frank shifted beside me, solid as a support beam. We'd laid our groundwork clean and square. Now we just had to watch it all come down. Ever notice how a room feels different when truth hits it? Like the air itself changes density. I'd seen it on job sites when someone's corner cutting finally came to light. Now I was watching it happen in pressed shirts and leather chairs. The lawyer read through those emails with the careful attention of someone checking load calculations. Each printed line stripped another layer off Tommy's story, revealing the rushed work underneath. My brother. I forced myself to think of him that way, to remember what we'd been. Kept shifting in his chair like a man feeling the floor go unsteady beneath him. March 15th, the lawyer said, his finger moving down the page. Mark's as good as dead anyway. Better to handle the transfers now while he's conveniently unavailable. He glanced at his own notes. That would be approximately 6 hours after your brother's admission to intensive care. Martinez, one of our senior directors, leaned forward. The same day as the first custodial transfer documents? Within 3 hours of them, Frank supplied, sliding another paper forward. His voice carried the same steady tone he'd use pointing out a critical flaw in someone's framing work. I kept my breathing even, letting the timeline do its job. You can't rush revelation any more than you can rush concrete setting. Around the table, faces had that look people get when they realize they've been working with warped materials. There's more, the lawyer continued. Once he's moved out of ICU, we can proceed with the restructuring as discussed. He looked up. This appears to coordinate precisely with the discharge date. Malice? Wilson whispered, the word falling into the room like a plumb bob finding true. I watched Tommy's face as that word landed. The smirk was gone now, replaced by something closer to drywall dust, pale and unsettled. You could almost see his carefully constructed narrative crumbling at the corners. If you'll check Section 4, I said, keeping my voice level, you'll find statements from 3 of our primary vendors. Each one confirms receiving rerouting requests initiated by my brother during my hospitalization. The sound of turning pages filled the room. I'd learned long ago that good documentation is like proper bracing. It holds up under pressure when everything else starts to give. Mr. Counsel, I said, given these communications and their timing, I'd ask you to rule on the validity of transfers executed without consent while I was under medical duress. The lawyer removed his glasses, polishing them slowly. I recognized the gesture. It's what people do when they're about to deliver news that changes everything. These transfers would appear to meet the criteria for fraudulent execution. The combination of documented medical incapacity and these communications suggesting premeditation. He replaced his glasses. In my opinion, they're voidable. Invalid from the moment of execution. Tommy's shoulders dropped like a failed support beam. Around the table, chairs creaked as people shifted their weight. Pens stopped moving, and eyes that had been scanning documents now fixed on him. For the first time since they'd wheeled me into that ICU, I felt my lungs fully expand. But I kept my focus tight. You don't celebrate until the inspection's complete and the permits are signed. Martinez cleared his throat. I move for an immediate corrective resolution. All transfers reversed. All authorities restored to their prior status. He looked around the table. Do I have a second? Seconded, Wilson said, his pen already moving. The first strike had landed clean and square, but I could feel the room wasn't finished. There was more weight yet to drop, and Tommy knew it too. I could see it in the way he stared at his own signature on those emails. Like a man watching his foundation crack straight through to bedrock. I stayed silent, letting the process work. Sometimes the strongest move in construction is knowing when to step back and let the structure show its own flaws. Frank shifted beside me, solid as ever. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The evidence we'd stacked so carefully was doing exactly what good materials always do, revealing the truth one layer at a time. Martinez passed the emails down to where the department heads sat as observers. I'd worked with most of them for years. Built their offices, renovated their homes, shared coffee on job sites. Now they leaned forward, papers rustling as they read Tommy's words for themselves. Listen to this, Peterson from accounting said, his voice carrying that tone people get when they've found rot behind fresh paint. Once we normalize operations under the new structure, the board vote becomes a formality. He looked up, mouth tight. Dated 3 days after the ICU admission. You know that silence that falls right before concrete starts to crack? That's what filled the room. I kept my breathing steady, the way I learned to do when checking load-bearing walls for fatal flaws. Here's another, Wilson added, tapping his copy. Mark's recovery timeline works in our favor. By the time he's coherent enough to protest, everything will be too settled to challenge. More murmurs rippled around the table. I'd heard that same tone on job sites when someone spots a support beam that's not up to code. That mix of disappointment and professional judgment. The company lawyer cleared his throat. For the record, he said, adjusting his glasses, I'm noting both the chief surgeon's affidavit and the finding of fraudulent transfer in today's minutes. He paused, pen hovering. Given the nature of these communications, I recommend a formal censure. Tommy pushed his chair back slightly. If I could just explain, he started, but his voice had that hollow sound you get when you knock on drywall and find nothing solid behind it. The company's stability was my only concern, he tried again, looking around the table. But everyone suddenly seemed fascinated by their papers or their coffee cups. It reminded me of how good carpenters react when they spot a warped board. They don't even need to speak. They just turn away, knowing it's not worth the risk. The chair, Reynolds, who'd approved my first major contract 20 years ago, squared his shoulders. I move that we immediately strip all interim titles and authorities granted to Thomas Delaney, and bar his access to all company accounts pending a full audit. His voice carried the same certainty I'd heard when he'd first trusted me with a $1 million project. Do I have a second? 3 hands went up before he finished speaking. I could have smiled. Could have looked at Tommy right then, let him see something in my face. But all I could think about was that hospital ceiling grid I'd counted squares on, and the sound of that discharge printer running somewhere down the hall. Gloating's like using cheap materials. It might feel good at first, but it never holds up. If the board agrees, I said, keeping my voice level, I'm prepared to step back into operations immediately. Frank's agreed to assist with the transition, helping ensure continuity. I nodded toward Frank, solid as a foundation beam beside me. Reynolds looked around the table, reading faces like I'd seen him read blueprints. One by one, heads nodded. No debate needed. Just like when you show someone solid craftsmanship. They recognize it instantly. The gavel came down once, clean as a chalk line snapping. Motion carries, Reynolds said. I watched Tommy in his chair then. All the starch gone out of him like a support that's finally given way. He stared at the emails in front of him, his own words doing what poor workmanship always does, revealing itself under pressure. The weeks after the board meeting blurred like sawdust in sunlight. Every morning, I'd wake before dawn. Old habits die harder than betrayals, and tackle another piece of the restoration. You ever notice how fixing things takes longer than breaking them? That's true for trust and timber both. First came the paperwork avalanche. I spent hours hunched over ledgers, my coffee going cold while I traced every transaction Tommy had touched. Frank sat across from me most days, his calloused fingers checking vendor statements against our records like he was measuring twice before cutting once. Found another one, he'd say, sliding papers my way. Garden Supply got a change of address notice 3 days after you went down. Then he'd make that low whistle he uses when he spots rotted wood behind fresh paint. I called each vendor personally. Funny how many remembered my voice from job sites years back. Mr. Delaney, they'd say, relief warming their tone. Good to hear you're back at the helm. Those calls mattered. In construction and life, reputations built one conversation at a time. But it was the porch that really brought me home. You remember that porch? The one that had creaked under my feet while I'd paced through those first awful days after discharge? Well, every groan in those boards had been talking to me, and now it was time to listen. I started early one Saturday, just as the sun was warming the morning fog. First, I pulled up the old decking, each board coming loose like a bad memory. The joists underneath told their own story. Some had gone soft where water had sneaked in through Tommy's neglect. Kind of poetic when you think about it. You know what's therapeutic? Running a plane over rough lumber. There's something about watching those curls of wood peel away, revealing clean grain underneath. Each pass felt like peeling back another layer of what Tommy had done. With every board I replaced, I thought about how Chief Surgeon had methodically documented my case. Precise, purposeful, no detail overlooked. Frank stopped by most days, bringing coffee and that steady presence that's worth more than any power tool. Looking square, he'd say, checking my levels with experienced eyes. Sometimes we'd talk about the board meeting, marking out how everything had fallen exactly like a plumb line dropping. 2 hits, Frank said one morning, holding my bracket while I drove in screws. That legal void of the transfers. That was the foundation shot. I nodded, sinking another screw. And those emails finishing his reputation, that was the roof falling in. Clean work, Frank agreed, the way he does when a joint comes together perfect. The new handrail went in last. I'd chosen white oak, costs more, but it'll outlast most troubles if you treat it right. As I was fitting the final piece, something Chief Surgeon had said came back to me. They wanted you gone, but you were ready. Ready didn't mean just awake or alert. Ready meant documented, prepared, built solid from the ground up. Yesterday morning, I spread a blueprint across that new handrail. Plans for the Wilson project, our first major contract since everything happened. The sun caught the fresh sealed grain, throwing shadows across the paper like nature's own drafting lines. Down the street, I heard Frank's truck rumbling away, heading to Price Lumber for the job. I sat on those new steps, solid as my restored company, and wrapped my hands around a coffee mug that didn't shake anymore. The house stood quiet behind me, squared true to the world again. You could smell sawdust in the air, mixed with morning coffee and that particular kind of quiet that comes after you've earned something back. Looking out across my rebuilt porch, feeling gratitude settle deeper than the anger ever ran, I spoke 5 words to the morning air. Not bitter, just true. Betrayal only sharpens the will to rise.